The Institute's Griffith Insurance Education Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan, and non-advocative educational organization dedicated to the teaching and study of insurance and risk management. In keeping with our mission, the following presentation is strictly instructional in nature and does not take a position on any issues.
Hi, I'm Mark Reagan. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia, and I'm pleased to be here with the Institute's Griffith Foundation Summer Series for legislative staffers. Really looking forward to our talk today. Today I'm going to be talking about risk management and the process of risk management, and hopefully you'll get a sense of how important it is to society in the United States, even though it's a little bit underappreciated sometimes. So first, what is risk management? It's not a term that's very common. It's not something that a lot of people know about. And in order to understand risk management, well, we have to understand what risk is. And risk is uncertainty about some sort of future economic loss. These economic losses can be things that maybe come immediately to mind: fire, lightning, lawsuits, cyber attacks, those sorts of things. We can go a little bit broader and some things that we've experienced maybe recently, like pandemics, supply chain disruptions, terrorism, that sort of thing. We could think about it in terms of not only losses but gains. So fluctuations in the stock market, right? That can positively affect somebody, but it can also have negative consequences. Oil prices, credit risk, and then going to a really macro level, inflation, recession, political uncertainty. These are all risks that we face in the United States, and risk management is trying to address those risks in a proactive manner. So risk management is the process that we use to systematically plan for these risks and put tools in place to weather economic losses. And when I say tools in place, that one of those tools, maybe we don't do anything about it, right? We monitor it, we keep an eye on it, but we don't take any specific action. But it's important that we understand that those risks are possible in the future. Another way to think about risk management is referred to as the Swiss cheese model. So if you look at the graphic here, we've got an arrow going across, and you could think about that arrow as the process that leads to a loss, right? So going from cause to effect. And what we have in order to keep those losses from happening is these slices of Swiss cheese, right, that the cause goes through. And if the cause gets through a hole and it gets through all the holes, then it can lead to a loss. And so risk management is the process of trying to get those slices of cheese in the way of that chain of events that leads to a loss, right? And the risk manager's job is to align the slices of cheese just right, try to minimize the holes in the cheese, and try to prevent those causes all the way going through to the final loss effect. And, one way to think about risk management is the type of thing that happens when risk management fails, right? So I've got, a few examples of major risk management failures that everybody is familiar with. Starting at the top left here, we've got the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. We've got the recent OceanGate submersible implosion, the 2008 financial crisis. This bottom left one is the Bhopal disaster in India, I think in the 1980s. The recent train derailment in Ohio, and then down here in the bottom right, we've got the Camp Fire in California a few years ago. And all of these stemmed from a failure of risk management, right? That's where it came from in the first place. And so imagine we've got millions of people in the United States who are dedicated. Their job is to manage risk, right? And even though I would say the vast majority of these people are very good at their job, these things still happen. So it's really unbelievable to imagine what things would look like if we didn't have risk management in place and we didn't have these processes to try to keep the worst things from happening. So what does a risk manager do? In the talk today, I'm going to be talking mostly about, from the perspective of corporate risk management. But what's really nice about risk management is that you can think about it from an individual perspective, right? And that's easy for basically any adult to do, right? We drive cars, we own homes. we face risks in our retirement and in our health. And so we can think about the way that we manage risk actually reflects the way that maybe a corporate risk manager might manage risk. But today I'm going to be talking about it from a corporate perspective, but also trying to give you some examples of how we might do this in our own lives. So risk managers, really up until about the 50s and before, they were responsible for buying insurance, and that's about it. As the role of risk management evolved, people started to realize, well, insurance really isn't the only thing that we should be doing to manage our risk. Why don't we involve some loss control, right? Why don't we try to do some things that prevent losses from happening or reduce the severity of losses when they do happen? And since, in the last, 70 years or something, that has really blossomed as an essential function of a risk manager. Today, the sort of broadest role of risk management is taking a holistic approach to risk. So a risk manager not only buys insurance and not only engages in loss control, managing those standard type risks, but also engages in sophisticated analytics, arranging alternative financing outside of a standard insurance contract, and may even engage in taking on new risks such as mergers and acquisitions, right? What are some risks that may not have been foretold by this merger or acquisition? Now, I will say I'm talking about a risk manager, and that is a specific role. Those roles tend to exist in larger companies, right? Big public companies, large private companies. Even small companies, though, they may not have a dedicated risk manager, but they do have somebody who is responsible for risk management. In a really small company, that may only be insurance, right? Maybe a little bit of loss control. But as the role of risk management grows, right, taking on these additional perspectives can really add value to a firm and do a better overall job in sort of mitigating the downside of taking on risk. The corporate risk management process, as a standard, and again, this is sort of a baseline version of what should be done. The actual risk management process is probably looks like spaghetti and meatballs on here. But this is a 4-step process. And starting at the top here, step 1, identify risks. Step 2, measure and evaluate those risks. Step 3, select risk management tools. And step 4, to implement those tools and review those decisions, monitor the process as it goes on. Now, I call this a process, but you'll probably note here that we've got arrows pointing all over the place. And that's because it's not a process that has a beginning and an end, but all of these things are happening concurrently, right? But the way to think about and explain this process, going through it in a specific order really helps to get a good idea of what this process looks like. And that's what we're going to do today. So step 1 is risk identification. And this is the most important step in the risk management process, because if you don't identify a risk, then there's no way that you can manage it, right? And that's when we get blindsided by these black swan type of events that nobody saw coming, and ended up being, really, really awful. Now, how do we do this? Well, there are a lot of different tools. One of the most important tools is experience, right? Experience of the risk manager in risk management in general. Right? Experience of the risk manager in risk management in that industry, right? So somebody who's in the tech industry or somebody who's in communications or whatever, they're going to have experience from losses that have happened at other companies in that industry and that sort of thing. And then experience within a specific company, right? Having seen all of the things that might go wrong. And then there are all sorts of other tools that we can use. We're not going to go through all of these, but on-site inspections are a good way to look and see if there are trip hazards and fire risks and that sort of thing. Going through contracts helps to understand whether a company is taking on new risk or properly managing the risk that they were facing in the first place. Reviewing finances helps to understand things like asset liability risk, foreign exchange risk, exposure to interest rate changes, that sort of thing. Government agencies like OSHA provide a lot of resources for people to understand the risks that they're facing. White papers released by insurance companies, white papers released by industry organizations, that can be a really good source of ways to identify risk. And there's one white paper that I wanted to share with you. So I think it's really interesting. It's a risk. If you think about this most recent risk that we all, so many people were blindsided by, the pandemic in 2020. I think pandemic was pretty low on a lot of people's priority list in terms of risks to manage. And then we see how it turned everything upside down, right? And so I think that's a good example of where there's a complete failure to even identify risk by a lot of different players, a lot of different companies, a lot of different, most individual people in the U.S. have never lived through anything like that. And so that was a risk that wasn't identified. The list of risks that exists is almost infinite. And I wanted to share this one with you because I thought it was so interesting. When I heard about it, I was sitting next to a guy from Lloyd's of London at a conference, and he told me about this white paper that he wrote. And it's about solar flares. So he sent me this paper. This paper is from 2013. But the risk of solar flares really hasn't changed much, believe it or not. This is just from the executive summary, but he says solar activities follows an 11-year cycle, and the geomagnetic storm risk for the cycle at the time of the paper was projected to peak in early 2015. Now, solar activity follows an 11-year cycle. That means that it's projected to peak again in 2026. So we've got an increased risk of solar flare coming up in the next few years. The highest risk of power outages from a solar flare is the Atlantic corridor between Washington, D.C. and New York City. I thought the audience here might be interested to learn about that. What happens with a solar flare is basically anything electronic stops working, period, done. And they need to, at the power stations, they need to replace transformers that were affected by it. And the actual outcome of that could be pretty devastating. The population at risk is 20 to 40 million people, with power outages from 16 days to as much as 1 or 2 years. And really, it stems from the supply chain risk, right? If they need to order new transformers, it may take months to get new transformers. And if this is a major event, everybody's demanding new transformers at the same time, right? And that creates a huge snarl in the supply chain. So I think it was a good example of one of those risks that almost nobody has ever thought about, but it's one of those risks that we could be blindsided by, just like we were with the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. So step 2 in the risk management process is to measure and evaluate the risk. So we need to first estimate the probability of loss. How likely is this loss to happen? We think about the risk of solar flares, right? We have a pretty decent sense of okay, we're talking about geologic time or space time. And so, that doesn't operate in the same way that, we do on a day-to-day basis, but we can have a good idea of how likelihood changes over time, right? And we've got this peak coming up in 2026. We know that from historical data. We're getting better and better at modeling those things. We can use now artificial intelligence to evaluate the probability of loss, again, based primarily on historical data. If there are events that have never happened before, or happen very rarely, that's going to be a lot more difficult to predict the probability of that happening. Earthquake is a really good example, right? An earthquake is inevitable at some point in the future, whether that's tomorrow or 2 years from now or 100 years from now. That's a little bit harder to discern. So we want to estimate the probability of loss, and we want to estimate the severity of loss. Now, how bad is that loss going to be in dollar terms, in terms of human lives lost, in terms of whatever metric is important? And if we want to think about the maximum possible loss, I mean, it could be infinite, right? It could be infinite if you're thinking about, a lawsuit, right? If there's a lawsuit, there really isn't any maximum amount that lawsuit could cost other than bankrupting the company, right? You lose everything. That's something that's really hard to justify managing because, well, you're managing an infinite loss. So most risk management focuses primarily on what's referred to as the maximum probable loss or the value at risk. And that is the worst outcome, the worst amount of loss that's likely to happen in whatever acceptable percentage of cases. Here I've got X percent. What percentage is acceptable? Depends on the company's risk attitude. It depends on the individual's risk attitude and how comfortable they feel with continuing to face a loss that exists outside of that, right? So some companies might say we want to manage risks that are likely to happen in 90% of cases or 95% of cases. If there's somebody who's really risk averse and really concerned about risk, maybe they say, I want to manage the worst that's likely to happen in 99% of cases, right? So, that's a function of the company's willingness to deal with residual risk. And when we have those values are helpful because they allow us to prioritize risks. We're going to take risks that are, we're going to handle risks that are really likely, that are potentially really bad, and knowing the probability and the severity of loss gives us some information on what tools are going to be the most appropriate to manage those losses. So, for example, insurance is a really good tool to manage, to finance losses that are high severity but really low likelihood, right? Fires, windstorms, tornadoes, right? To any one individual, that's relatively unlikely. Insurance is not a great tool for high probability, low severity, right? So I wouldn't buy insurance on, losing my pen or something like that. A company wouldn't buy insurance on, a grocery store wouldn't buy insurance on something like spoilage, right? That happens every day at grocery stores. It's really high probability, but the severity of loss, unless there's a power outage or something like that, is not very high. Right, so putting these together helps us figure out which tools are probably going to be the best options for managing these risks. And one way to visualize this is to put these risks on what's referred to as a risk map. So if you look at this at the left side of this, we've got likelihood on the y-axis, right? How likely this is to occur, and here it's on a scale of 1 to 5. It could be on a scale of 0 to 100%, right? And then on the x-axis, we've got the impact. How severe is that event? And what we need to be most concerned about is those high likelihood, high impact events, right? Things that are really likely to happen and could potentially bankrupt the company or have devastating economic consequences. And you can see in this illustration, we've got number 3, a copper price rise at over 10%. This is some made up tech company. Number 4, a work stoppage over a week. For some reason, that's very likely in this scenario. But copper prices, they change a lot, right? So and they can swing pretty significantly. So it seems reasonable to see that in the top right corner. You also see number 1, a supply chain disruption, something like that, right? So we're going to prioritize this top right of the risk map. Kind of our number 1 priority. We need to make sure we're really on top of those. Bottom left, that's the least important risk, right? Low probability, low severity, something that you may want to keep an eye on, something you may want to have a plan for. But those are the ones that sort of are lowest on the priority list, and the top right is the highest. Step 3 in the risk management process is to choose which risk management tools you're going to use. So there are 2 general categories of risk management tools. So one category is loss control, and that is the things that we can do to change the nature of the risk, to manage the probability of loss, the likelihood of loss, or manage the severity. And if we want to reduce the probability of loss, that's referred to as prevention. If we want to reduce the severity of loss, that's called reduction, loss reduction. Right? And those 2 things happen all the time, right? And when we're talking about choosing a risk management tool, typically we don't choose one, right? Especially for those for those big risks, potentially high severity risks, we want to engage in multiple layers, right? Put in those levels of that Swiss cheese to prevent the cause from fully realizing into the effect. So we've got our loss control, but no matter how much loss control you do, right, there is no way to guarantee that a loss isn't going to occur. Losses will happen. And so the next question is, how do we pay for those losses? Right? We can categorize that into internal financing of losses. We retain the risk, right? And we can either pre-fund those. We would do that if it's something that's relatively big, right? We need to have a savings account for it. Or if it's small, maybe it's just part of the cost of doing business, right? But we at least need to recognize that and make a conscious decision whether this should be a funded loss or an unfunded loss. If we don't want to retain, or maybe jointly with retention, we can transfer that risk to an external party, right? And the first the first risk transfer option that you might think of is an insurance company, right? They're in the job of taking on risks, right, and people transferring risk to them. That's one option. Another option is a contractual risk transfer outside of insurance. So it could be a supplier and a retailer. They're going to have part of that agreement that says, if something happens, who's responsible for the risk? That's a version of contractual risk transfer. And then if we're talking about commodities and the price of copper, like in the last slide, there may be hedging involved, right? The same is true when it comes to fuel prices for airlines and other sorts of financial tools, right? We may engage in hedging to try to manage that risk. So that was a little bit abstract, right? And so I thought it might be helpful to give you an example of where we might see each of these things, and workers' compensation is a good example. So with workers' compensation, if an employee gets injured on the job, right, they get all of their medical expenses taken care of. They get lost wages, proportion of their lost wages while they're out of work. And then there's some other benefits as well. So what sort of loss control options are available for workers' compensation risk? Well, we've got prevention, right? We're going to try to reduce the likelihood of a workers' compensation claim. We're going to reduce the likelihood that somebody gets injured. So that may be something like a safety training program. It may be back braces, right, to prevent back injuries on the job. If we want to engage also in reduction, right, reduction of the severity of loss, one common tool is a return to work plan, right? The longer somebody's out of work, the more money they're collecting for their lost wages. And so most companies have some sort of return to work plan for injured employees, even just getting them back in sort of a reduced capacity. Maybe they only work part-time, maybe they work in an office or something like that. But that not only does that help reduce lost wages costs, but it gets them, there's a lot of evidence that it gets those injured employees to heal faster. It helps them with any sort of mental health issues that they're dealing with after a bad injury, that sort of thing. Another loss reduction tool is hard hats, right? A hard hat doesn't keep a brick from falling on your head, but if a brick does fall on your head, right, you're much less likely to die, right? So that reduces the severity of a loss. In terms of loss financing, right, how are we going to pay for workers' comp claims that occur? One option is retention. Larger companies, a lot of them will self-fund workers' comp claims. They won't buy workers' compensation insurance. They may set up some sort of sophisticated internal financing tool. So that would be a version of retention. But even if you buy insurance, if you have a deductible, that's retention, right? Even if you're thinking about risk, homeowners risk, right, to your home, your deductible is you retaining part of that risk, right? And if you have a $5,000 or $10,000 deductible, maybe even more if you're in a high risk area, maybe a percentage of your home's value, well, that's you retaining it, and you better make sure that you have money available to cover that deductible, because you're not going to get it from the insurance company. In terms of transfer, right, workers' compensation insurance is a way to transfer risk away from the company managing the risk to an insurance company. Also, outsourcing claims management to a third-party administrator helps to transfer the risk of dedicating resources to managing workers' comp claims internally, right? And having a third-party company help get people back to work and make sure people are going to the doctor and that sort of thing. So how do we decide on which risk management tool is appropriate? Well, I mean, that's a very complicated question for a 20-30 minute presentation, but here's some important things that the risk manager needs to keep in mind. So how much the tool costs, right? And there are explicit costs, such as the insurance premium or however much the training program costs. There are also implicit costs that don't have a specific dollar amount, but still are costly in a different way. So how much does the company want to outsource their workers' comp claims management to an insurance company? Right? They're relying on a third party to manage those risks, and that may not be ideal for the company. If they implement a training program, how long is this training program? Are they losing time and productivity by getting employees to participate in the training program? Okay, let's weigh that against the benefits. We've got explicit benefits. How much are loss costs going to decrease? How is that going to impact the company's profits? But also, are there benefits in terms of employee morale? Do employees feel like the company is investing in their safety and cares about them? Be a benefit. If they don't like the training program, maybe it's a cost as well. How is the company able to implement this risk management tool? Maybe it's too sophisticated. Maybe maybe it's not exactly what they were looking for. Something like that. Residual risk. So after the risk management tools have been implemented, how much risk remains? Right? How much is the company, right? We can't completely eliminate risk. Is the risk that remains something that the company can stomach? Right? And then there are many other factors, right? This is just sort of an example of some of the things that a risk manager might consider. And we also need to think about the likelihood and severity of a loss, right? Like I mentioned earlier, that high severity, low likelihood, that's where insurance is really well placed to be a good risk management tool. And then step 4, implement those risk management tools that you've decided on and monitor, buy the insurance, set up the training program, install whatever safety, railings or guards or whatever it is that you decided on. And then ask yourself, and this is really where it's more of this, cycle. Is it working, right? Is this safety training program actually reducing employee injuries? Has the risk changed at all? Right? Does the risk still exist in the same form? Did we open up a new plant? Are we manufacturing something new? Are we using new machinery? Has the risk changed, right? You can think about it from a cyber risk perspective. Okay, we put together these really sophisticated anti-hacking measures. Cyber risk is constantly changing, right? And so the answer to that question is usually no for cyber risk because it changes so quickly. And then is whatever we chose still the best option, or are there new options available that may be better for what we're looking for? And all that to say, risk is everywhere we look. And that's part of why I love what I do so much, is because once people understand how ubiquitous risk is across all of society, I think they have a new appreciation for risk and risk management. In terms of risk managers, good risk managers have a lot of different qualities, but there are 3 what I think are essential qualities. And that is, 1, they need to be proactive, right? Reactive risk managers fail very quickly because that means that the loss has already happened. So they need to be proactive. They need to be detail oriented. They need to line up that Swiss cheese so that the holes are as small as possible, right? And you need to know exactly where all the holes are in detail in order to keep things from slipping through the cracks. And then 3rd is that they need to be good communicators, because this can be a hard thing to sell, right? Especially if a risk manager is saying, this is a bigger risk than you realize. I don't think we should do this, or we need to sell this training program to the employees and really get them to buy in on operating in a safer manner. But that's an essential role for a risk manager. And so finally, as I said at the beginning, risk management has an essential role in our economy, tends to be unappreciated. And I hope that my talk with you today gives you a new appreciation for risk management and the role it has in our society. Thanks very much. Hope you have a great day.